So now that we've looked at Hobbes and Locke and Rawls, what are the benefits to social contract theory and what are the detractions? In other words, what are the pros and cons? Well, for one thing, social contract theory is objective. Social contract theory creates morality that is dependent on something outside of typical individual or societal whims. With relativism, if morality is relative to my opinion, well, it just is dependent on my particular belief at that time. While morality is a human construct, it's creating the contract that is set outside of us. And so we have to appeal to that contract to settle moral disputes rather than individual or societal opinions. So it's handy in that it's objective. Well, it's also not dependent on God and not dependent on strict reasoning. Consider natural law theory. If you go the route within natural law theory of God created divine law, and that includes moral law, and reason is how we access that, that puts a lot of dependency on morality on God, on our capability to reason properly to get to the conclusion. So we want to, try and maybe extract morality from that because of the various problems. It also provides motivation to be moral. My motivation in a social contract to be moral is to not be voted off the island, so to speak, right? My being moral, my following the rules, means that I get to continue to enjoy the protections of the society. We could easily write into a social contract that those people who do not participate in it appropriately can be exiled from the society. And that would be detrimental to my welfare. So in order to motivate people to be moral, they put something like that into the contract. So taking advantage, okay, so this is take advantage. Wow, that writing's really bad. Sorry about that, guys. Take advantage of benefits. The deterrent from not being moral is basically avoid consequences. So many people don't do things they consider immoral because they don't want to suffer the consequences. Kids learn to not lie to mom and dad because they don't want to get grounded. So we avoid those consequences by not being immoral. Okay, so it's a deterrent from not being moral. In other words, it stops us from doing bad things. And when we look at just basic consequentialism, or definitely we look at something like natural law theory or Kantian morality, it's not clear that those motivations are there. For Kant, you do the right thing because it's the right thing. Your motivation is supposed to be from duty. But looking around, we might have reason to think that human nature is not inclined to act simply from a motivation of duty. Psychological egoism might have a point. We might largely be motivated to do things because they're in our self-interest. As rational creatures, we recognize our self-interest is being part of a cooperative society, playing our appropriate part in that cooperative society so that we can continue to enjoy the protections and not be left out all on our own. Does that make sense? Well, the negatives, the cons, one thing is, I don't know about you all, but I've never actually consented to the contract that I'm bound by. Okay, now we're shifting into legal terms here just for the example, okay? We're not claiming that morality is in fact comes from a social contract. But when a society is created, new generations come into that society, none of them were party to the sessions that resulted in the contract being built. You know, if we look at our Constitution as a contract that we are party to, and it's a legal one, not necessarily a moral one, but it is a contract that we're party to. I don't know about you all, but I wasn't around for the writing of the Constitution. You know, I didn't make it to any of those constitutional congresses. I also did not participate in choosing a representative from my state to go to the Constitutional Congress. I didn't, you know, I wasn't involved in choosing the representative that was in the first House of Representatives and Senate that constructed the Bill of Rights. So we're party to a whole lot of rules that we weren't actually involved in. We never had much say so in. Now, the response is yes, but you've stayed in the country, you've enjoyed the protections. You know, perhaps if at 18 they actually gave us a choice, okay, now you're going to be party to this contract or you need to leave the country, that might be more overt, but we did enjoy the protections. You know, particularly once we turn 18, we enjoy the protections that the contract provides us. And as a result, that might be implied consent, but we tend to want more overt consent. Another issue, another concern is that the moral community is restricted to only rational creatures. When we consider the moral community, we're considering those people that we expect to behave morally and we will hold accountable if they don't perform morally, but also those are the individuals we have obligations to. This is reminiscent of Kant, okay? Remember, we treat people, rational creatures, as ends in themselves, never solely as a means. The problem is, what do we do with non-rational creatures? Okay, children, for example, aren't rational as children. The 4-year-old is not truly rational. Sorry to break it to you, but if you have 4-year-olds, look around, pay attention. They're not really rational. But that's completely understandable. They're 4 years old. Their brains have not developed significantly for them to be considered rational creatures. That's why we don't hold them morally responsible for doing something. You know, the 4-year-old that gets a hold of his dad's gun and shoots his 6-year-old brother, we don't think the 4-year-old's going to hell. We might hold the father morally responsible for leaving the gun, allowing the 4-year-old to get a hold of the gun, but the 4-year-old didn't understand the consequences. So the 4-year-old is not a member of the moral community. Animals, not rational creatures, not in the way persons are. As a result, they are not members of the moral community. And if children and animals are not members of the moral community, it's not clear we have any obligations to them whatsoever. We don't have any obligations to not torture them, to not abuse them. Now, of course, we can build into the contract rules that result in our treating them in a certain way. And it makes perfect sense to, particularly with children. If we don't build into the contract rules on treating children well, making sure they survive, society dies off pretty quick, right? We won't have any children to grow up and continue the society. And certainly there are positive consequences to making those sorts of rules. When it comes to animals, Immanuel Kant believed that we ought to be kind to animals because not being kind to them hardens us and might make us more inclined to be not kind to other persons. But there's no obvious obligation to them. So we tend to think that those members of our moral community are those individuals that we have obvious obligations to. Social contract theory does not require us to build in rules about how to treat non-rational creatures. And some people might think that's a problem. Social contract theory doesn't object to your building those rules into the contract. It just doesn't require it. It requires building into the contract ways to treat other rational creatures, but it does not extend the moral community past that. And that can be a problem. Does that make sense? So you can look at those pros and cons and come to your own conclusion about, how much of a pro or how much of a con that it is. And of course, if you have questions, please feel free to rewind and re-listen. And you can email me if you'd like. Just remember, sign your email or I will not respond. Have a great week.